Welcome, everybody. I want to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Linda Robinson, and she's the Senior Fellow for Women in Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she writes about women's political and economic leadership, the relationship between gender equality and democracy, technology-facilitated violence, and current international affairs. She was previously a senior international researcher and director at the Center for Middle East Public Policy at the RAND Corporation. She's also been a fellow at the Wilson Center, the Merrill Center at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. She's a former foreign correspondent for U.S. News and World Report and a senior editor at Foreign Affairs magazine. Ms. Robinson provides frequent commentary on international affairs and U.S. foreign policy. Her books include Masters of Chaos, a New York Times bestseller, Tell Me How This Ends, a foreign affairs bestseller, and a New York Times notable book of 2008. She's published over 20 RAND studies and hundreds of articles based on extensive field research and has testified before Congress on special operations, the Iraq War, and the Middle East. Let's welcome Linda Robinson today as our speaker.
Thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm so glad to be with all of you today. I'm in New York, where I've been attending the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women meetings, and this year, this annual conference is also marking the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Conference, which issued the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So it's a busy week with multiple meetings every hour. I wanted to also say I'm really delighted to speak with the World Affairs Council. I've always found these terrific audiences. For many years, several decades, I've been privileged to join World Affairs Council meetings. So thank you. So what I'd like to do is talk to you about women's political leadership, why I think that's such a key issue, talk about the current status, and some of the reasons why we are actually at a crisis moment and what might be done about that. I want to be sure to leave plenty of time for comments and questions. So I will go through some of my presentation. I think I'll leave out some of the statistics, but I think it's very important why I've chosen to really focus on political representation and leadership is that it's a key area that can affect all the other areas of gender equality and also to contribute to our democracy's decision-making at the very top. And of course, you are perhaps aware of the various ways in which women and girls still fall behind, whether it's the digital divide, poverty, violence, and increasingly an area of climate change where women are on the front lines of those being forced to migrate and suffering food insecurity. So for all these reasons, I really think it's critical to be aware of how women are doing in leadership. And while there has been a great deal of progress, if you look back 30 years to Beijing or pick your point decades ago, there has been progress. But what has been happening in recent years is there's been a gradual stalling of those steady but slow increases. And we're now we're stalling and we're beginning to tip downward in key areas. So I'd like to just sketch this in a little bit of detail. For example, right now, only 24 countries are led by women. About half of those are in Europe, and this is out of 193 UN member states. 106 countries have never had a woman head of state or government. And as many of you are probably aware, last year was a bonanza year of elections, but only 5 of the 31 directly elected presidents were women. I would like to call out those 5 because they're important, and they include Mexico, where Claudia Sheinbaum is the first ever woman to be elected. In little Moldova, sitting right next to Ukraine, Maya Sandu was one of the few incumbents re-elected to power in a very difficult election with lots of Russian-backed disinformation and some really wide-scale vote buying. Iceland, which has always been a leader in gender equality, reelected a woman as president. North Macedonia elected a president, and in Namibia, in Africa, elected its first ever president. So those are very important milestones, but yet they total only 11% of the current leadership. That's very far from parity. I hope you don't get tired of me pointing out throughout my remarks that women are half of the world's population. And this is why people are beginning to really focus on parity. While the gains have been made, they haven't even achieved what is called critical mass, far be it actual parity, which would be a 50-50 mix. Only 9 countries have parity in their cabinets, and this is actually tipped down from a previous high of 15. And in those cabinet positions, women overwhelmingly fill the roles of either the gender equality minister, social affairs, cultural affairs, not what are called the power ministries of defense, finance, interior, and foreign affairs. So that's an example of the landscape. I'd like to dwell a little bit on Parliament because this is where, of course, they're the most available slots. They're rigorously tracked in terms of statistics. Only 6 parliaments in the world have achieved parity. That would be 50-50 representation. And only 23% of women are the speakers of their parliament. The really alarming figure that has been put out by the Interparliamentary Union, which is the gold standard for this data, is that women's gains in parliament have been the lowest since 2017. It's been progressively slowing down since then. And now this last year's increases were only 0.03%. And just to make a little bit clear what that means, in 2/3 of the elections held last year, there were fewer women elected than previously held seats. This was true in the US Congress, where the lowest number of women was elected since 2011. And this showed up also in fewer incumbents running for office and fewer candidates. And this pipeline issue is what has people watching this very concerned. There are many indications around the world that fewer young women are interested in running. And I'm ecstatic that you have so many students there today. And I hope we could talk a little bit about this. It's been quite a topic of conversation here at the UN and side events that I've been attending. So very briefly, I'd like to discuss why I think this is happening. And I've just finished writing a book about this, so I could go on at length, but what I want to do is just sketch 3 of the factors that in combination are exerting the downward pressure and really significant headwinds that I think will continue to depress candidacies and women winning office unless they're dealt with. And the first one is this macro phenomenon of democratic regression and the rise of authoritarian governments, and many of them coming to power through the ballot box. Authoritarian populism is very much on the rise around the world. And as part of that, there's quite a bit of scholarship that shows in tandem with that authoritarianism comes policies and beliefs that really don't enhance women's opportunities in public life. And I would just point out one very concerning statement from our current defense secretary in a book that he wrote before taking office. He said, "We need moms, but not in the military and certainly not in combat." And I recognize you'll be going to the War College, and I previously served as the chair of the advisory board to the War College, so I'm delighted you'll have a chance to go there. You will learn a lot on your visit. Some of you may already know. Women form 18.5% of our uniformed military at the present. So this is a very critical part of our armed forces and the defense of democracy. When President Trump came into office in January, one of the very first acts taken was the firing of the first woman to be the commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Linda Fagan. And then shortly after, the first woman to be chief of naval operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, was also fired. And Defense Secretary Hegseth also removed the senior military assistant. There's always a senior military officer who is assigned to be the advisor, direct advisor to that top official, civilian official. And she was also removed. You're probably also very aware of the removal of program funding and personnel from many areas surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And gender equality has essentially been scrubbed from government programs, databases, and so forth. I'm focused, of course, on what's just happened here in the US, but this is a pattern that we've seen in many countries. Hungary is one which has gone a fair distance down this road. There are countries of concern in Latin America. There are other countries we could talk about. The second phenomenon that I'd like to note, and again, I'll be very brief here, even briefer, and it's a very troubling element in the rising extremism. There is a portion of this that is violent misogyny, that is hostile to women to the degree of advocating violence against women, coercive and punitive policies. And some of these figures are having some influence within circles of government, which I find particularly concerning. Some of the most notorious figures with their social influencer role are Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes describes himself as an ardent incel, involuntary celibate, which is this particular little subset, which actually has inspired violence, some mass killings in a few countries, including our own, Canada, elsewhere. The final factor that is really exerting downward pressure is a massive phenomenon, and that is online gender-based violence. And this has a range of manifestations. It can be abuse, hate speech. It can be threats of violence. It can actually be inciting attacks. One thing the researchers who are very deep in this area emphasize is simply the volume and violence of the language. And a lot of it is artificially promoted through the algorithms and recommender systems. It can be overwhelming. And the most targeted of all are women leaders. The more prominent the women are in the public space, the more they get attacked. The Dutch Deputy Prime Minister, Sigrid Kaag, she was receiving one hateful and threatening tweet every 15 minutes. Jacinda Ardern, another figure, was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, incredibly popular, reelected by a landslide, had 100%, twice the amount of violent speech and death threats against her. And she was really subjected to what people across the political spectrum in New Zealand agreed was an unprecedented type of attack against one of their leaders. So we could talk more about the problems, but I would like to talk now about some of the solutions. And some of these are really focused on our country, but they have analogs in the international sphere. The first thing is what to do to encourage women to run, because I think without women taking positions of power, they won't have the ability to implement some of the systemic reforms that are needed to both help democracy, but also help women play a larger role in it. So there are many groups around the country. Emerge America is one of them. She Should Run is another one. Emerge America is very interesting in that you can apply and say, I want to run for office, and they will take you on as a trainee. They will help you with fundraising networks. It's really a soup to nuts kind of support for candidates, women candidates. And I would encourage any of you who think you might want to have that as a career or a second career to really check it out and see what you might want to do in that area. The other thing that is happening, and I mentioned it earlier, is parity is going to be the goal coming out of this commission on the status of women. And rather than look at small gains, they really want to advertise the goal should be parity. Again, on this theory that women are half of the population. Women have really achieved parity in education. There's a lot of experience. There's a deep talent pool. There is, I think, still a deficit with some of the fundraising networks, which can be difficult, especially in this country where the election campaigns are so expensive. But there is no reason not to aspire to parity. The talent is there. The other campaign I wanted to call attention to is, it's called Madam Secretary General. The Global Women Leaders Organization has launched this campaign to have a woman Secretary General of the United Nations. And this is really, I think, an interesting campaign because, again, there are many former women heads of state who are highly qualified. And the theory here is that having someone with a global position of authority really telegraphs to women and girls around the world, yes, you can do it, the so-called role model effect. And I think that would be a really tremendous boost of encouragement to people around the world. The other area I think that is so sticky. There are structural barriers, of course. I referenced this in terms of fundraising and the childcare structure and things that enable women to be able to do this. But there's something called bedrock bias. And this is a sticky issue because polls show that people, 77% in one of the most recent polls, say they're equally ready to elect a woman president. And of course, we had one, Kamala Harris came within 1.5% of winning the popular vote. Of course, we have the Electoral College, which means our president isn't elected by popular vote. But it's one of these enduring puzzles that even though people routinely say they're willing to elect a woman, there's always an oh, but. And of course, people's platforms, people's track records, etc., voters are going to judge on this specific person. But there is a persistent feeling that the glass ceiling is intact because there is hidden bias or strategic bias. And strategic bias means people who say and may be perfectly willing to vote for a woman, but when they go into the voting booth, they say, are my neighbors ready? Or am I going to waste my vote if I vote for a woman? And this is, in my view, the thing that still keeps us from electing a woman president in this country. So a couple of final points about remedies, and then I very much want to get into discussion with all of you. Our democracy is not as representative as many other democracies around the world. In fact, most democracies have been through numerous constitutional amendments. They've been through numerous processes to make their electoral systems more representative. That is not the case in the US, where there is such a high bar. One of the things that comes out quite clearly in the statistics is democracies that have some version of proportional representation elect far and away more women than those that do not. In our case, the single member district, winner take all, these represent even higher barriers, but more importantly for democracy, they tend to favor the extremes. They accentuate the polarization, which of course we all know has become a very acute problem in our country. There's an organization called Fair Vote. That is one of the groups that's been promoting ranked choice voting, which is one of the options to introduce a proportional representation scheme. And it's been implemented at state and local level. Alaska is one of the places that has adopted it. And in fact, there was a referendum this past November to try to recall that proportional voting scheme, and it was voted down. So Alaska has voted to keep with it. And there is, I think, a fairly good track record that people are drawn more to campaign more widely because of the ranked choice voting. They have to appeal beyond their base and be seen to be electable, acceptable, and advantageous for a wider cohort of voters. The last thing I want to touch on is the comments about technology, digital technology. The US Congress actually has many legislative proposals that address the problems with our highly unregulated tech environment. The big enchilada, of course, is the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, that absolves the tech companies of any liability for anything that happens on their platforms. And there are many proposals that some of that liability should be curtailed. There are also specific gendered bills. Take It Down is one of them that goes after the deep fake porn problem. Artificial intelligence has led anyone to be able to create a deep fake porn, and this is hitting women political leaders very hard. In fact, in the UK, they rushed a bill through Parliament when it became clear that so many women in the last election were being targeted and attacked by this. So there are many legislative proposals in Congress, but none have made it through. And I don't think that their prospects right now are very good, with the exception of possibly some on child sexual abuse material, which has wider support. And this is caught up in a thorny argument about what constitutes censorship. And I think we need to have a really wide-ranging public dialogue. In many cases, it's about the company's own codes of conduct not being implemented, not being enforced. And it's about the way the systems are designed. The algorithms are really designed to promote violent, sexual, salacious material. And women, there are many studies showing how women are far and away the biggest targets. There is a very important landmark bill the European Union has passed called the Digital Services Act. And what it does is it really requires the largest platforms, most of them domiciled here in the US, but the world's largest platforms sign up to a code of conduct, and it's their responsibility to assess their systems for risk and come up with ways to mitigate that risk. And they define 6 areas of systemic risk, and one of them is for gender-based violence, which is very important because it recognizes the disproportionate toll that women are suffering. And then the companies have the responsibility to design and enforce the remedies and share the data with the European Union to show what they are doing. And then finally, if they do not do that, there is a fine scheme, a very hefty fine scheme of 6% of revenues that if they are not complying and not showing that they're attempting to comply, they can have these fines levied against them. So I think some of these details are very important for people to understand, so that that to clarify, this is not about governments coming in to do content moderation or to get involved in censoring material. They're simply holding companies responsible for creating a safe environment, much the way many products are subject to regulation, subject to safety standards. So with that, I'm going to close out here and turn over to your moderator. And I really welcome any questions, but above all, I think it's a great platform for you to express your thoughts about these topics. Thank you.
Informative and disturbing as well.
Very disturbing.
Okay, I'm going to carry the mic around. We're going to use the Mike Sutton rules. I'll hold on to the mic. One person can ask one question, and I'll ask you to identify yourself. If you're with if you're with the school, please note what school you're with as well. And we'd like to encourage the women in the audience and the female students in particular to fire your questions, because we got a great presenter who's raised some disturbing issues for all of us. Who wants to kick it off? Raise your hand. Okay, you bring the mic back there. Your name, please, and your question.
Elizabeth Schmoyer. Is this presentation available to high school students?
Mike,
Uh,
can you answer that question? Are we going to provide this on tape for the students in the who might not be able to make it here today?
We're recording it to our YouTube channel, and we're recording the webinar. We'll post it to our YouTube channel. Yes.
YouTube channel.
Yes. Who's next?
Okay.
Professor Noonan. Professor Noonan of Penn State and our board.
Thanks. I was doing campaigning last year, and one of the things that disturbed me was I would sometimes talk to men who had.
That's all.
Mike,
It's off. It's on now. I was doing some campaigning.
let's try it again.
Technical glitch.
Third time's charm. Yes. Okay, I was doing campaigning last year. One of the things I noticed was that often women had doubts about women candidates. I remember talking to one person who was, trying to be very honest in her opinion and said, well, I wouldn't vote for a female candidate because they have to deal with all these men out there in the world, and I don't think they can. And, and then I really didn't know how to answer that, because I'm wondering, what can we do to get women to support women candidates? Can sometimes be an issue.
Thank you so much for that. And also thank you for advertising that this will be available online. I am, women and men are almost equally prejudiced in this realm. It's an excellent question. There's something called the World Values Survey. And in this realm of politics, women as suitable leaders of countries, and women are only 8% less prejudiced in this area. So you have put your finger on a very important issue. And one explanation is that, of course, women are socialized by the same forces, educationally, family, etc., that as men are. So it may be a surprise on one level, but as you found out in your canvassing, it's very real. And the statistics have actually shown that in the two elections of President Trump, white women were a key constituency. More white women voted for President Trump than for the other candidate. And there are a variety of reasons this could be happening, but it is a marked fact. And so I think this is why I try to open the conversation about bias in a general way, because it's a pervasive issue. Now, I mentioned some very, the advocacy of violence against women and the kind of just incredibly vicious and violent language we're seeing online and the so-called manosphere. There's certainly a subset, and there's some very troubling polls showing that young men, the Gen Z cohort, are feeling especially aggrieved about gender equality and feel that these measures to bring more women in prejudice their chances. So these are all things that we have to get after, but I hope that for people who care about democracy, we can really have that conversation in a civil way. So thank you for bringing that up.
Question.
What's going on?
Okay, all the way across the room there with me. And we'll have a student question here, I think. Great. Your name and school, please.
My name is Yelixa. I'm from Muhlenberg High School. You talked a lot about the online presence of influencers and their views affecting a lot of what's happening on social media towards women today. Do you, like, in your experience and from what you have seen, do you believe it's going to continue going down into like the path of like the manosphere and get grander before it gets any better? Or do you think we're seeing a rise in kind of like a counter to?
I'm
Tough
very,
question.
yes, a very, very tough question. And I hope that I don't leave you all feeling discouraged, because I think it's really a moment for civic action and for people who care about this. And on International Women's Day, I posted on my LinkedIn feed an appeal to men who are husbands, fathers, brothers. You know, I think if you look at your female family members and you want the best for them, I think that in most every family that would be the case. And it's really a matter of pushing back against some of these things. And what happens online doesn't stay online, right? There's really a continuum. And what I am very concerned about is the language that used to be really cloistered in some of these spaces. And again, some of it really happens on these closed platforms, Discord, Gab, Getter, Parler, you know, these niche 4chan, which is where a lot of the deep fake porn originates, and then it jumps over. It's migrated into our politics. And I think that should give everyone great concern. And I did, you know, I mentioned the cases of these very distinguished women leaders in uniform, you know, 40-year careers of serving in the military and the Coast Guard side by side with men, very distinguished, and they're dismissed as, quote, DEI hires. And in my LinkedIn post, I just asked for people who didn't agree to stand up and push back and to support those women and to do the same with their young women who are coming up and thinking, what do I want to do in the world? If we don't have women really wanting to get into the political arena, I'm afraid this environment won't change. I also, as I think you may be able to read in between the lines, I definitely think there are good measures that need to be legislated. And the one in Europe really is the one to watch. The European Union led the way in data privacy. The GDPR, as the law was called, became the global standard for how to protect people's data privacy. Whenever you go online and you have to accept that what type of information is going to be shared or opt out, this all came about because of that law pioneered there. And I think it's very important to understand that a safer environment is in everyone's in everyone's interest. And it is not to say women leaders shouldn't be criticized vociferously. We shouldn't have a debate on public policy grounds, but it's about this profane and sexualized, demeaning violence. The deep fake porns, they're just aimed at delegitimizing the women and chasing them out of the public space. So I want to be very clear about what I think should be out, and there's a wide range of what is in, because of course the freedom of speech is critical to our democratic society.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take advantage of asking a question, if I may. You noted that diversity, equity, and inclusion in this country is under attack. How troublesome is that to the goal of parity? And what's the worldwide situation? Is it similarly under attack at other countries in the world?
Well, very interestingly, this is, I'll answer the second part first, and I'll use again, because the European Union really has set the gold standard with gender equality measures that have to be in place before countries join the European Union. It has the most advanced set of guidelines and standards, and their goal is to bring it within the European Union structure itself to bring themselves up to parity in their leadership. But also they have a code of conduct. It's a directive on combating gender-based violence. And there are also international conventions that many countries have signed up to. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That's a mouthful, I know. CEDAW is the acronym. That has the widest uptake. We signed it, but we didn't ratify it. And there are countries that have signed it, but they have exceptions for certain pieces that they're not going to. Many of the Arab countries, for example, there are pieces that they believe would conflict with Sharia, and they will not adopt them. In the case of the countries that accept that full process, they undergo a rigorous review process. I believe it's every 5 years. And there's a board of experts that really surveys what they're doing well in, what they're not doing well in. And it's kind of an accountability mechanism that is very important. In our case, now coming back to the DEI programs, and they vary, greatly across nonprofits, private sector, in the government. And I think what has been the real shame of this is most of us who've done this research understand there are qualified candidates, people of color, of marginalized background, women, who have not been given equal consideration in competing for jobs. You've had, and as one of my favorite women leaders, Katrín Jakobsdóttir of Iceland, she says, the internet was made by men for men. And actually, if you look at the tech sector, it is heavily populated by men, and the venture capital, which funds them, entirely populated by men. So the point is, let's bring more people in. They're talented, they're equally capable. It's not about putting an unqualified person in the job. And my view is qualified people love to compete against qualified people. We have a competitive process in our electoral system. I'd like to make it more competitive. I think we need a wider range, a bigger spectrum of people competing. And I think that's the essential problem, is people misunderstand what DEI was intended to do. And I was extremely upset to see many companies, quite a few major companies, saying, oh, our program has accomplished our objective, or board membership. Oh, we have enough women. So in the face of the new administration's rollback, which it does have the power to extinguish those programs within the US government. I'm not a lawyer, but I think there is executive purview for some of the things happening. I think some of the cuts in funding will be found to be unconstitutional, in that the US Congress duly appropriated and obligated funds. All of our programs for women around the world, virtually all of them, are being gutted, and I don't think will be refunded. And we are one of the major donors, especially for women in humanitarian need. So I hope that you will all call your Congress person if you care about that. But anyway, I think the DEI is horribly misunderstood, and we need advocates coming to the fore. And it's fine to scrutinize the program. Is it working as intended? But to just get rid of it, I'm afraid we're just leaving talent on the sidelines.
Question out there. Rodney, I can count on you. Long-time member Rodney LaPearl.
Why do you think Vice President Harris lost this last election?
I was scrutinizing all the polls, and I hope if some of you know of an exit poll that asked the bias question outright, I would love to see that. But none of the exit polls that I saw just put that question right out there. A lot of times people don't give their true beliefs on in answer to polls. But I think that, and of course, she had a higher bar being a woman and a woman of color for those who do have those biases, whether acknowledged or not. There are a couple of things that obviously played against her. 102 days is not a very long time to campaign. I also, and I wrote several articles about this, as I observed her role as the first woman vice president, she was not projected in the media that often. She was not really given center stage very often in the White House, even though she was heading some very important initiatives, including on artificial intelligence. She was the head of the Space Policy Council. She was involved in numerous trade and economic development initiatives from Asia to Africa. She was doing a lot of things, but people didn't really hear about it. So I think that I would say those factors, plus the polls show clearly the unhappiness of many Americans with the state of the economy, or I would say state of their pocketbook. We all felt this. The inflation, when it goes up, it doesn't come down. Meat costs more, all these prices people are very aware of, even if the macroeconomic statistics were actually better. But I think it was a combination of some drag of the Biden administration's low approval, her not having enough time, although $1 billion raised. She had very enthusiastic rallies. You saw them. The places were packed with people. She was polling very well. And then I do, even though I have no evidence, this is why I started with a question about exit polls. I think there is a definite fact of this latent bias. And of course, the egregious sexist and racist slurs that were part of the campaign against her. It's what makes me really grieve for the state of our civil and public discourse.
You had one up at the Penn State table. You had one up at the Penn State table again.
There, right there.
Fine, it's good, David. How are you? I just want to say, first of all, thank you. I've read a number of your articles in Foreign Affairs over the years. My question is related to where you are today. Being at the UN and the council that you're attending, all of your commentary today has been directed towards democracies and the rights of women and what's going on here. We know that there are many countries in the world where religion and socioeconomic and cultural aspects limit women's involvement. How do you view that changing, if at all, in the future?
Thank you so very much. And that really, I appreciate the question, because the back half of my book is about women fighting dictatorships. And so I wanted to show examples of women from President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. She's now stepped down, but 2 incredibly successful terms as China was really ramping up and up and up. And she did this. She crafted a very successful multi-pronged defense and trade policy to defend against China. At the same time, she was opening up with wider democracy, more gender equality. It's already a very gender diverse and gender equal society. And she was really the first case study I wanted to have in the book, but also a number of women leaders around Europe. Maya Sandu, I mentioned, who just beat a full onslaught Russian-backed campaign to win re-election. Mia Motley down in Barbados doing incredible things to enable climate finance for many countries in the developing world that are just getting hammered by climate change. So I wanted to show women fighting back against these forces. The book is only half about the forces coming at women in democracy, but also trying to build up democracy. Right now, if you depends on where you put India. So one of the democracy trackers, Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, they have been rating for years Modi's India as an electoral autocracy. If you include India in the autocracy camp, 70% of the world's population lives under autocracy. That's why your question is so important, because there are all these people around the world who have, whether they voted in that autocrat, as in Hungary, or not, they are now living in a country where the democratic norms never existed or have been eroded. And in many cases, you can chart the tandem decline of women's rights in those countries. And so my thesis really is that we need to strengthen and expand democracy and start evening that balance. What has to happen, though, in many cases is, and I spent many years in the Middle East, some of you may know that work that I've done, and that is just going to be a very long time. It's, as you may know, obviously, it's at the bottom of the entire world in terms of women's political representation. There are countries like the United Arab Emirates, they have 50% in their Supreme Council, but it's really, it's not a lawmaking body. It has representation, but not the power that you would have in a legislature in a democracy. The same you could say of Rwanda, the same you would say of Nicaragua, where I spent my early career in Latin America. And it's so tragic to see what has happened in Nicaragua and Venezuela. So we have an array of autocracies around the world that by culture or by strong men coming to power and not letting go, have seized the reins of power and will not let go. One thing that is interesting is a worldwide democracy movement, and some of them are clustered in Lithuania, especially those that are fighting for democracy in Eurasia. It's kind of become a hub for democracy activism. There was a worldwide democracy activist movement that was supported by the National Endowment for Democracy. That's something, that was set up to help. It was very vital for countries in the Cold War and after it to have this support from the US for democracy builders. There is a real question about whether the US government is going to continue support for that. It's in the courts. We've had a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats, speaking out because it's benefited. There's the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. It's been a very bipartisan effort to support democracy around the world. And my hope, that's really the crown jewel of what we have to fight autocracy and support democracy. And again, I guess I'm begging for all of you with your interest in coming to this meeting today, whatever you care about on this spectrum of democracy and women's representation issues, please, representatives log the calls. If you call and leave your message, they will hear it. If you write a letter, they will hear it. I think it's really what is going to make the difference in the world is if the American people make their voices known. Thank you.
Another question from a woman here.
My name is Geisha Dennis, and I'm from Pennsylvania State University, Berks. And I have a question with how organizations are pulling back on DEI initiatives. Do you think it's going to have a long-lasting effect on opportunities available for women in the workforce?
Unfortunately, I do. I'm terrified of this, and I think that it's something that we need. Again, we need male allies to say we want opportunities for our sisters and daughters and wives. And it's not a special dispensation. It's simply being able to compete and being seen, where many times, I love the example of the auditioning for symphonic orchestras. And the standard now is the musician will have their audition behind a screen. And I think if we just think of it that way, let's have a screen, take the names off the resumes, have a process where people are allowed to compete. And then in the workplace, we have to be very sensitive to ways in which meetings are conducted. And if people don't have a chance to speak and participate, their leadership skills, A, won't be developed, and B, won't be recognized. And I just hope, I think at this moment, we are probably going to see a fall off. I'm very concerned about the women in uniform, and that is something that is going to hurt our national security. If you think about it, we've already been struggling to meet recruitment numbers for a variety of reasons. And you may have had speakers that address this, but if we discourage women and we're telegraphing to them, there's no place in the service for you, or you're not considered an equal, you're not going to have an equal shot. That cohort, if they do not renew or even apply, our military is going to suffer dramatically. I know that we have, oh, good, we've got just a few minutes. I would like to just make all of you aware of a couple of resources if you care about these issues. Our program, we have something called the Women's Power Index, and we refresh it every few months to make sure the data is up to date. The UN Women, and it's just run together, UN Women at .org, that will give you the UN's data, the Interparliamentary Union I already mentioned, and they have each year at this time, they publish a document called Women in Parliament and Women in Politics. And those are really very detailed statistical and analytic compendiums. So you can really find out much more about everything I've been talking about. And I'm available to people as well. We have most of our programs are online. If you go to CFR.org and go to the Women in Foreign Policy program, almost all of our roundtables, as with your programs, you can find them online, and the research that we are doing. And I just would like to encourage, and especially those who are students, we have an internship program, and there are research associates. So we have at various levels in your educational process opportunities to come. Those of you who are graduates or have even a master's degree and want to come, there's also international affairs fellows. They're in Washington and New York, as well as several abroad in other countries, Japan, India, and so forth. So I just wanted to take a moment to make sure you know the resources that are available and how eager I would be to follow up as you may wish. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much for your time today. This was a wonderful presentation, and thanks for your generosity with the Q&A section. That was very valuable. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I do have a gift for you. We will be sending that to you via mail. Lynn Brown will reach out to you and get your mailing address. We'll make sure that it gets to you. But thank you again so much for your time today and a wonderful presentation.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you, and have a great day.